Hello and welcome. My name is Jessica Leno, and I'm the Executive Director at the Stanford King Center on Global Development. Thank you for joining us today for this discussion. Before we jump into this virtual fireside chat, I wanted to share a little bit about our center. The King Center works to help improve the lives of people living in poverty around the world. The center does this in three main ways. We support research that aims to inform policy and practice on critical development issues. We help train the next generation of thinkers and leaders in global development, and we foster conversations about current issues in poverty alleviation and development. Today's discussion is part of the King Center Speaker Series, which features talks by distinguished scholars and policymakers. This event is recorded, and the recording will be posted on the King Center's website early next week. And we welcome two special guests today to discuss the challenges of protecting biodiversity and environmental quality while achieving economic development. I will start by introducing Larry Goulder. He's the Shuzo Nishihara Professor in Environmental and Resource Economics at Stanford University and the Director of the Stanford Center for Environmental and Energy Policy Analysis. He's also a King Center faculty affiliate. His research covers a range of environmental issues, including green tax reform, the design of environmental tax systems and emissions trading policies, and climate change policy. Thank you, Larry, for being with us today, and I look forward to the discussion, and I'll turn the floor over to you to introduce our next guest.
Thanks very much, Jessica. Just before introducing Partha, I feel it's appropriate to at least acknowledge the distress and sadness we feel about the emerging violence and human suffering in Ukraine. I think we will go ahead and have our discussion now. It's focusing on environmental issues and human development. And it's a very important issue as well, but it just seemed appropriate at least to acknowledge that for many of us, this is a major distraction. That said, it's a great privilege and a pleasure to introduce Professor Sir Partha Dasgupta, the Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of University of Cambridge, truly one of the most eminent economists of the past many decades. He's had a huge impact in many areas of economics, including the economics of development in low-income countries, economics of human welfare, economics of technological change, and of course, environmental and ecological economics. He's won so many honors and awards that we won't have time to go through them now, but I guess I will mention as one indicator of his stature, not that long ago, Queen Elizabeth II knighted him for his, quote, services to economics. A recent and important contribution was his 2021 publication of what's called the Dasgupta Review of the Economics of Biodiversity, a review that was commissioned by the UK government to investigate the relationship of the economy to biodiversity and nature. And this review is already considered one of the deepest and one of the most comprehensive assessments of the nature of the challenges posed by biodiversity. So Partha, it's really a delight to have a conversation with you, and we're going to focus in general on addressing what are often competing goals, the goals of economic development on the one hand, and promoting biodiversity, or more broadly, environmental quality on the other. There happens to be, as you know, a lot of interest in this here at Stanford because we're about to open a brand new school, a school devoted to sustainability. So a lot of folks will be are already interested and even more interested in what you have to say because of the school. So welcome. We would have liked to have this fireside chat in person, but we'll settle for this. The coronavirus intervened, and so we'll have to settle for a virtual conversation. It's a delight to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let me start off by saying, although you've contributed to a great many fields of economics, a consistent theme in your work is the connection between the economy and nature. So can you tell us how you came to focus on this connection, a connection which, by the way, was generally ignored in earlier economic growth models? So what can you tell us about how this connection came about in your own work?
Well, thank you for asking me this question. And I should begin by saying, in some sense, it is not inappropriate for us to discuss what we are doing to Mother Nature and the biosphere in general in the context of the attack on the Ukraine that is currently we're witnessing, because in a sense we have been nature has been under assault by the human economy, by we all in one way or the other, and that's what we'll be speaking about. So there's a family resemblance in my sense. To address your, to reflect on your question, at my age, I do a bit of that kind of reflection anyway, so it comes out naturally. I think my earliest interest in it, now I look back on it, was my geography teacher in middle school in what is now Varanasi, in a wonderful school I went to for 2 years between the ages of 13 and 15. And my geography teacher, if I remember well, and I do, taught us geography as an analytical subject, not as a vector of facts about the location of places and the food people eat. And I think that was simmering in me. But the most proximate reason was in 1978, just by accident. I was an economist, standard form at the London School of Economics. I came across a book, treatise by Anne and Paul Ehrlich and John Holdren called Ecoscience. Now you must remember, I think I'm pretty correct in saying that ecology is really a very new subject. I mean, in our lifetime, as it were, or put it this way, it's on Paul Ehrlich's lifetime. So it has really evolved. And at that time, I'm not sure there were any textbooks. I didn't even know the word ecology, never heard of it. But I came across this for a variety of reasons, and I started working through it. And it really was fascinating for me because although the authors didn't quite put it that way, I sensed that what they were trying to tell us was that nature is a capital asset, that the ecosystems are capital assets, and there are these incredible processes providing goods and services, which all this is now commonplace, of course, as normal currency of talk. But at that time, it all came very new to me. And what I did, and I'll stop there, what I did, and that's really what excited my interest, was I wrote down a mathematical model of each chapter. And I found that actually it was the same model over and over again. Now that may be my limitation, of course, obviously good not saying, but it did tell me that we were looking at capital assets, which are producing goods and services, which had intrinsic value, use value, and so forth. And what we need to do is to embrace that within the human economy. So, okay, since then I've been, and of course, the final reason is that, of course, it's a very beautiful subject. I mean, what could be more beautiful than trying to understand the human economy as embedded in the biosphere? I mean, nothing could be richer. So.
Well, I'm glad you think it's beautiful and enchanting, because I have a friend who, when I sent my recent book to him, he said he uses it when he's having trouble sleeping. But you're introducing natural capital, introducing capital of that kind into a growth model was really a revolutionary change in many ways, because the earlier growth models, they had just man-made or human-made capital, machines, and factories, as well as labor. And this really launched what is now, as you said, very common and very much used. Your capital, I guess, was originally land, so it's fixed, but the models over time have also incorporated renewable natural capital so that it changes according to biological growth. Let me turn to a focus of your review, which is threats to biodiversity. The UK government commissioned review emphasizes that human well-being is dependent on the natural world, and including the ecosystem services provided by natural capital. I want to ask you, based on your review and other research you've done, what would you claim are the critical services that are most threatened? And I guess I'd add to that, How serious would you regard this problem to be?
Well, I can begin by starting at the end by saying it's an incredibly important problem. And I mean, above all else, we ought to concentrate on it. So then I'll come back to your original question. I should mention that the allusion to the Ehrlich-Holden book treatise that I meant, it had an immediate influence on me because in 1982, I published a book called The Control of Resources, in which I literally framed the problem of our relationship with nature as a problem of renewable resources, regenerative, self-regenerative resources. Of course, I didn't at that time have full understanding as much as I do now about the complexity of thinking along that line. And I hope the review has gone into it, but it went far beyond land, by the way. Okay, the prototypical example would be fisheries or forests, but it can be, the entire thing can be enlarged. So what are the critical things? Now, although my review is on the economics of biodiversity, I pretty quickly reverted to my original training, as I keep on mentioning the three-authored book, and saw biodiversity as a characteristic of ecosystems, and that what we should be studying are ecosystems and the processes that connect them to one another and result in the goods and services that we all enjoy, which on the basis of which we exist. The variety of services like climate regulation, nitrogen fixation, decomposition of waste, which is extremely important and we ignore in our economic models, pollination, recycling of nutrients, and so forth, and so on, okay? And that's in some sense, for economists, it'll be like the basic industry, and everything else sits on it. Okay, so what are the critical ones? Well, one of the first calculations in my review was something which I'm really quite proud of because I don't think anybody had actually done it, which was to estimate the rate of return. I mean, that is to say the yield, the own rate of return on one class of assets which produce, which are photosynthesize, so that they're primary producers. And a very quick calculation that was given by ecologists gave me a figure of about 20% a year annual yield. That's about 4 times the yield, historical yield on produced capital. And those of you listeners here who know something about economics of finance will say, well, that doesn't prove very much because you need a capital gains term. What happens to the relative price of the two? And of course, when you think of that, then you realize, of course, it's just going the wrong way. Because if we were efficiently using all our assets, then produced capital value relative to primary producers, okay, now that part of natural capital should be growing at about 15%. Capital gains ought to be about 15%. But of course, natural capital has been declining and produced capital has been expanding. So the capital gains ought to be in the reverse direction. So it sort of proves it's just a box, by the way, in my book, in the review, but it shows immediately how wildly off we are, okay, before all else. So what are important things? Well, I think that calculation points to the fact that primary producers are really seriously under threat. And that means we're looking at the oceans, we're looking at the tropical rainforests, these two gigantic biomes, if you like. I mean, that's just a starter. Of course, you can go spend the rest of the hour discussing all the various types of regions which are under threat. But as biomes, I think that's a good starting point for thinking that we're really off our kilter.
So if I can translate that, if there's a very high implied rate of return, is it suggesting that engaging in remediation or in conservation related to, say, for example, the ocean and forest, produces a return to an investment that's well higher than most of the returns to ordinary investments? Is that a fair interpretation?
That's exactly right, of course, but the return will be in accounting terms because the institutions are so awry, which has allowed this imbalance to take place. It's not going to be seen through market forces, go without saying, because if it were, we wouldn't be doing what we are doing. But we're talking now about where to put our fingers on and how the institutions need to be changed. So the answer is yes. But I want to say just one thing which maybe listeners will not necessarily appreciate. When we talk of conservation, we really mean investment. An investment for Mother Nature, in Mother Nature, means leaving her alone, letting her flourish. So the idea of investment, the picture we have when we use the term investment, usually is a bunch of people, using lathes and God knows what else to dig the soil and build buildings and so forth. It's nothing like that. The investment in nature really means helping her to regenerate. And unless there are incentives for doing that, and our institutions are so awry that, of course, they're not doing that. So we ought to bear that in mind. We do mean conservation, yes, but that should be seen as investment.
So very connected with that, there are political issues here, partly because people recognize that protecting nature comes at a cost. There's an opportunity cost. If you keep land in its quote unquote natural or unmanaged state, that prevents conversion to farmland or conversion to urban infrastructure. And people disagree about what's worth protecting, what's worth experiencing those costs. So connect with the point you just made about this high rate of return. Can you say something about how we actually can try to measure that in order to try to convince people that this is worth it?
Well, actually, I've just given you an example of the measurement, because if you follow the economics logic and want to look at the yield, you ask yourself, what's the stock and what's the output from that stock?
And in this case, the output is what?
Is photosynthesis, production,
Okay.
That's the output. And the point is to recognize, okay, so let me put it slightly differently. This tension that we talk about, and saying, well, there's a cost. The cost is in terms of what ecologists call, or the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment called provisional goods. We're looking at food, water, timber, fibers, and so forth. The stuff that is reflected in our GDP. Okay, also the materials that we take and therefore convert them into buildings, roads, ports, and so forth and so on, okay, which are the engine of economic development as we see it now, as we economists have defined development, okay? That our demand for provisioning goods goes counter to the services Mother Nature offers us, which MEA called regulating and maintenance services, which I enumerated a few minutes ago. Those are the hidden ones, which we don't see often. In fact, one of the subtleties is Mother Nature is usually silent and invisible. Think of what's happening under our feet in the soils, all the fungi out there, and the oceans, deep in the oceans. All that's churning out goods and stuff like a factory. It's a buzzing factory out there. They're very silent, so we don't hear the buzz. But without them, we don't get the provisioning service. But if we concentrate on the provisioning goods, if you like, and then we concentrate on that and put a zero price on the stuff that we don't see, we're basically eating into our capital assets. That's the tension, okay? So the issue is to recognize it, the productivity of nature. And I'm now looking at it purely anthropocentrically, okay?
Right.
As a first cut on it, okay? And
Right.
that takes us a long way. So I'm not embarrassed about being anthropocentric here, because we can then add other values to nature. But at the moment, I'm just looking at it anthropocentrically. If you look at it that way, then we're looking at the primary stuff, the capital assets, which are the basis of life as we know it. If that is priced at zero, then of course, every time you mention not having another cutting down, creating a road system through a wetland, you'll say, well, there's a cost there. But of course there's a cost, given the fact that the benefits which we are suppressing has a zero price. And on top of that, of course, we are subsidizing the assault on nature by the extent of $4 to $6 trillion a year. Okay, so it's not just a zero price, it's negative price. We're paying ourselves to actually eat into this capital asset. So it's unbelievable when you think about it in a pure hard-headed economic terms. the market prices are not reflecting it, and we understand why. But if we do understand why, we shouldn't be talking in terms of costs using market prices. We need to be thinking in terms of accounting prices, shadow prices,
Right.
because they're reflecting the productivity, the stuff that's actually enabling us to survive.
Well, it's encouraging that economists like yourself and others, as well as many ecologists, biologists, others, are able now to measure these often ignored values. And of course, the next step, or at least a next step, is to get the political will to introduce perhaps policy changes so that these values will be incorporated in decisions that are made. Let me turn to sustainable development. Your work basically argues, perhaps one of the most fundamental things you argue, is that safeguarding the natural world is a central requirement for sustainable development. And obviously this is a focus of Stanford's plan for the school. At the risk of being overly academic, I want you to see if you can offer what you would use as your definition of it. And I say it partly because I've encountered so many folks that have either difficulty defining it or they have very different notions. And there's some disagreements perhaps between economists and non-economists as to how it should be defined. So I want to ask you to take a stand on this, or at least offer how you think, what you think is the best definition, because then that can influence where we go forward.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, that's exactly right to ask that. I took my, if you want to look at the verbal currency, the word sustainable development was essentially became a key word in 1987 in the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future. And I think on the whole, they got the idea right. I think Brundtland Commission report was correct. They talked about the assets that the generation hands over to the successive generation, the bundle of assets. Okay, so they were looking at capital stocks. That's extremely important because we think in terms of GDP, which is not a stock, it's a flow. So we are already moving to a different way of thinking. And they're asking the question whether we're handing over to our successors as much of capital assets that we inherited ourselves. And that's an intuitively plausible way of thinking about it, reasonable way of thinking about it, because parents think like that about their children. What are we handing over to them? We think in terms of education, human capital, maybe stocks and shares, if we're lucky, houses and so forth, if you're really lucky, and so forth. Okay, but we are looking at assets. So the move from flows to stock was the right move. Okay, but the trouble was, of course, that the Brundtland Commission couldn't really aggregate the assets, but they said about assets, but there are zillions of assets, and you need a weighting system. What is it? What is it that you're handing over? And that's where the economics comes in useful. So here's the theorem which the review is built on. You give me a conception of intergenerational well-being, that is not only this generation's, but next generations and so forth. And the utilitarian calculus has one way of thinking about intergenerational well-being, but it doesn't have to be that. You could be a Buddhist, you could be anything. You have a conception of today, tomorrow, and day after, okay? And think in terms of human well-being. Then I will give you a measure of the value of the assets, not just produced capital, but they're important too. Not only human capital, that's also important, but natural capital in the way we describe in terms of ecosystem stocks and so forth. Such that there will be value for each of them, such that if well-being across the generations increases, then this measure of wealth will increase. And if well-being across the generation declines through our policies, then so will inclusive wealth decline. So that nails the idea of sustainable development, because you're asking whether we are leaving behind for our successors a world which is more, at least as productive, if you like, as in terms of assets, as we had inherited ourselves. Now that's how we define sustainable development in the review. It, in a sense, gives an intellectual basis for the intuition that was in the Brundtland report. But not because I thought that's the holy grail. That wasn't the point. But it's just that I proved she was on the right. She had the right measure without having the right reason. If I
could add or interject here, it sounds like then the definition of, or the requirement of sustainable development is that enough of these assets, some combination is retained so that future generations can have a quality of life at least as well, at least as
That's
high.
exactly.
But then this raises what's become a very thorny issue in some cases between economists and many non-economists, which is which assets can we substitute in particular?
Yeah. Okay.
Can we deplete or reduce some natural resources, reduce that asset? Is that okay as long as we can substitute increased investments in human capital or in physical capital? And there are many who are uneasy about the idea of losing a lot of natural capital and would argue that there isn't much substitutability. What is your view on that?
No, they're uneasy about it largely because they haven't really spent any time on the subject. And I think I want to make it absolutely clear because I'm a completely, totally, if you like, what's it called, a card-carrying economist. No ifs and buts about it. I belong to the tribe of economists, so I can criticize our group, my tribe. Okay, I mean it's not a foreign tribe; it's my home. We economists haven't spent more than 5 minutes talking to ecologists, and I think it's a disgrace. The reason here is this: that at the moment, from the earth sciences, from the ecological sciences, and from ecological economics, the imbalance between the accumulation of produced capital and human capital on the one hand, and the net decumulation of natural capital has become so large that the first port of call is not going to be about substitutability possibilities. We are way beyond that now. We have cut into nature, and I'm talking about now about 4 or 5 different intellectual attacks on the question of where we are today. They're all pointing in the same direction. Okay, so it's not just me and my review, it's also the earth sciences of planetary boundaries, for example, or it's the little example I gave you about the rate of return on primary producers. They're all pointing to the huge imbalance we have created. So my first port of call is not going to be about subtleties of substitution possibilities. Of course, there could be some minor areas that could be, but the assault should be now on protecting nature.
So even if you were very optimistic about the potential for substituting human capital or physical man-made capital for some kinds of natural, the loss of natural capital is so large that no degree of substitutability is imaginable.
Well, what can I say? Yes, that's effectively, at the moment, put it this way, you asked me about the idea of sustainable development, and I gave you a theorem about inclusive wealth, which was, and your following question followed naturally from that, because inclusive wealth is the sum of the various values of the 3 types of capital assets. And if you're going to move forward with it, upward with over time, you might say, well, okay, we're depreciating natural capital, but if we are accumulating human capital and produced capital sufficiently high, well, of course, the wealth is increasing. So why are you complaining?
There are many other questions I want to ask you.
No, I'm saying that we are far beyond that now.
Okay.
At this point in sustainable development, my first port of call is going to be to look at the imbalance we have created in our demand from Mother Nature. Okay. And we should be asking the following question, and we do, my review does that at considerable length. What is the annual demand we make on Mother Nature in terms of taking from her the services, the basis of the services? And what is Mother Nature's ability to supply meet that demand on a sustainable basis? And the answer is the demand far exceeds the supply. So at this point, it's like a firefighting situation at the global level. And the kinds of services that I was talking about, for example, the primary production of the oceans, they're so important and so threatened that attention should be given there, literally. And the institutional changes that we ought to be looking for should be targeted at seeing what are the imperfections we have created, which have led us to this overshoot.
So I want to ask you about differences across countries on the sustainable development front and the associated environmental justice issues. Much of you are known for having focused a lot on sustainable development, in particular as it applies to low-income countries. But there's a kind of dilemma sort of akin to a poverty trap, whereby the low-income countries have this horrible choice to make between using up enough resources to maintain subsistence consumption today versus preserving them and investing in the future and meeting sustainability by keeping enough resources in the ground. Is there a way to overcome that dilemma? Is there, what can be done?
Well, at one level, this dilemma has been created by, in my judgment, a completely phony picture of the model of human economic development. We're looking at economic development in a world in which huge numbers of assets are unpriced, worse, negatively priced, as I suggested before. Okay, so we should start with that. Now you can say, let's get rid of these distortions. But if you do, that's a good starting point of thought. We really have to remove,
like the subsidies, for example.
Yes, like the $46 trillion of subsidies. Like, for example, compensating countries to helping them to preserve, paying them to preserve the rainforest they house because they're in national jurisdiction, but yet they're global public goods. So if we have payment for ecosystem services nationally, why on earth can't we think of payments for ecosystem services internationally? Then what about the oceans, which are out there? 50 to 60% of the photosynthesis takes place out there, and yet it's a free good. It's an open access resource. What about charging for the use of the oceans, for all the transportation of goods and service, goods that take place annually, trillions of dollars annually, by the way, okay? All the ships that are towing goods, then on the fisheries, and then the stuff we are dumping into the oceans. None of that is being charged for. So we have a huge amount to do in that direction. So that's the first point. Given that, if you focus on the poorest countries, I think we raise problems which are probably not there. Now, I'm not suggesting there aren't some problems, goes without saying, but let me start on the other side of things. So you have primary producers. It's not an accident, we should remember, that the world's poorest countries happen to be in the tropics. Currently poorest countries happen to be in the tropics. And it's not an accident that the tropics also house some of the greatest biodiversity, okay, like the tropical rainforest. These two are potent combinations because the way for them to lift themselves out of poverty, official way of looking at it, is raise your exports. And that way you can invest and then grow, accumulate human capital, produce capital and so forth, then go in for economic development that way. On the other hand, the exports are usually, or mostly, primary products. And they're hitting on their ecosystems, whether it's through mining or whether it's through deforestation or you name it, or converting into plantations and so forth. Now, there are missing markets there in a big, big way, just as it's everywhere else. Missing markets in the sense that there are negative externalities that their costs are borne by inhabitant natives of those countries. Okay, let's say you're deforesting the uplands, forest in the uplands. Well, the downstream farmers and fishermen are affected, but they're not being compensated, which tells us what? It tells us that the export price of these goods is below the social cost. So in effect, we have a perverse situation. We are saying, let's go for expanding exports because that's the way you can lift yourself out of poverty. And at the same time, they're handing over wealth to the importing countries. That's completely perverse.
Right.
Because that's the wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. And by the way, there's no conspiracy here. It's just bad economics. And so you have the WTO talking about export, free trade, but you're looking at free trade, the idea of free trade in a world with such severe distortions that I know of no economic theorem which subscribes to free trade as an efficient way of running things. So we have a long way to go. I think the whole model is wrong. And I think one final thing, the damage that has taken place in poor countries, the poorest countries, over changes of property rights, of governance, from local management of common property resources in villages to management through dictate from the center of political centers, has been huge. So a lot of the suffering that people have experienced over the past 60, 70 years was certainly through the post-colonial period, through mismanagement here, in governance, alterations in government structures. We don't take that into account. So
is the problem from local government, or is it caused by the central?
It's local government. Yes, indeed. Very local government. Yes, indeed. Take forests in Nepal and so forth. I mean, who controls the forest? Who owns the forest? There are the inhabitants. There are local management systems which have developed over centuries. And if they're disrupted, we have a serious management problem. And there are tons of work on this, by the way. I'm not giving you anecdotes. The review is 600 pages long, and there are 3 chapters on these issues, the micromanagement of local ecosystems. So in a sense, I see this alleged conflict between development and poverty is a way we're forcing that on. It's not, a great deal of it is a misconception. If you regard ecosystems as assets, and you worry about property rights, you worry about the structure of governance, that will take you a long way before you ask questions of the kind that, is development consistent with the, protection of nature and so forth. Those are sort of highfalutin sort of the kinds of question you ask at a dinner party, dinner party, but not for serious.
For clarification, it sounds like one of the things you suggested for developing countries is to expand exports. It would be another source of revenue, which then can be help to deal with current consumption.
No, I'm suggesting just the reverse. I'm suggesting that they should be taxing their exports. It'll be in the interest of African countries, for example, to act as a collective. Of course, each individual African country will not wish to do that because they'll lose on exports. The importing country will go to a neighboring country for the same primary product. But what they don't seem to realize that they're losing money every time they export.
That's right.
Because they're not reaping the cost of the export. Okay, the price is too low. So the only way to correct for that infection, that externality, which they haven't internalized, is for them to act collectively and impose a charge on the exports. They should be paid for what they're giving us. They're not. At the moment, we in the West are actually enjoying rather cheap stuff from them, because a lot of the harm that's being, it's cheap because people are being affected adversely in those countries. The downstream farmers, the landslides, you name it. I mean, I didn't go into the details, it's pretty sordid, but the fact is people are suffering, all in the name of development. But
now I see what you mean. And even though that might come at some cost in terms of the quantity, hopefully the so-called elasticity isn't so great that there would still be an increase in export revenues. And you know of the EIPER student here at Stanford, who when she was here, actually looked at the question of how sustainability would be affected if natural resource intensive products from developing countries were actually sold on the international market at their full social value. And it would make a big difference in terms of the sustainability of it.
We also think of, imagine we had an international organization, we had the courage to create an international organization to charge for the oceans. And we could be reaping billions, okay? And when I say we, I mean the human economy, not just any country. And that could be used for development purposes, repatriation, you name it, and then paying for the protection of the rainforests.
Right.
Because those happen to be global public goods, but within national jurisdictions. So Brazil could justifiably, although it's not condoning their behavior, but they could justifiably say that, look, the benefit to us of conserving the rainforest is lower than the benefit to humanity. So why should we be the bearers of all the costs? Well, at that point, we should be negotiating and say, well, how much, I know that's going to be hard, but the fact is, we have payment for ecosystem services within national jurisdictions. And what I'm suggesting is that we really need to introduce it, at least the review argues rather forcefully, that economic logic suggests that we ought to extend it to the international sphere.
Well, it's encouraging to hear that, at least in some contexts, what I had called the dilemma between the goals of meeting current consumption needs and achieving sustainability, it need not be actual trade-off, at least in some contexts, like for example.
A large number of countries. I think we can
at least in some cases
act in a big way
right.
if we take economics seriously. Yeah.
Let me ask you too. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention to our listeners that we will be having a Q&A session starting about 5 minutes from now. And so if you would like to offer a question electronically, we'll be able to address at least some of those starting in around 5 minutes. Let me pose two difficult questions and different ones, and you can pick which one or answer both. These are difficult because I'm kind of asking you to venture into the political realm a little more. One is, you mentioned ways that we can overcome this trade-off and help achieve a sustainable development, especially in the low-income countries. Is there any prospect for being able to introduce the cures that you mentioned politically? That's one. The other question, separate, but I'm asking it now just to save some time. Where, in your view, does addressing human population growth enter into the mission of achieving sustainable development? You can take either or both.
No, I'm going to start with the latter because that's the thing that usually gets bypassed. I don't know why. Population is central in my review, as any reader will find determined, because there are reproductive externalities. So the idea that you can simply say that's out of bounds in a discussion on our treatment of Mother Nature is just rubbish. Can't be. Because if we complain about our consumption behavior as being towards profligacy and so forth, why can't we do that? And that's because, let us say, because the prices of food is too low, largely because all these unpriced externalities, okay, then we should take population equally seriously. That's the first cut into the thing. Why do I take it very seriously quantitatively? And the reason is this. It is in polite society at dinner parties, amongst the elite in the West, the idea is that, of course, it's overconsumption, which is the thing. And if we can reduce our consumption somehow or the other, and then we will be able to get a balance between the demands we make on Mother Nature's regulating and maintenance services and her ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. The equality of demand and supply at the very basic level, which is absolutely essential before we can talk about sustainable development. Okay, all right. So do a very simple calculation. The rich countries are the OECD countries. It's a club of rich countries. Currently, the average income of OECD countries is about $40,000 a year. Suppose you halve it, make it 20,000. Now, of course, shrieks of horror. Goes without saying, halving income is no joke. Well, very crude calculations tell me immediately it's still not going to meet the gap between demand and supply. In fact, there'll be still a huge gap because the gap at the moment is huge. It's something like 1.6. The demand to supply is about 1.6, that ratio, okay? And one is obviously what you want to go for. Eventually, we want to have it less than one because you want to let Mother Nature regenerate. But never mind that, just to get equal. You can't do it just simply consumption. So that conceit that in a comfortable dinner table, we say, of course, we're consuming too much. And then tomorrow we forget about the matter. That's not going to work. Numbers matter hugely. Today, the population is 7.8 billion. The median projection of the United Nations is about 10.2 billion in 2100, of which the major increase is going to be from sub-Saharan Africa, which is also the poorest region. So so much of my work has been on poverty, and that is why I do not feel shy about thinking about the problems that the descent, my students, I have innumerable students in sub-Saharan Africa through these programs that I was involved with, teaching programs, worry about their children and great-grandchildren, grandchildren and so forth. And hence the idea that they should be taxing their primary product exports and so forth, because it's to allow them to thrive. Now, Africa's population today is about 1.1 billion. and is projected to be 3.8 billion in 2100. That's the median projection of the United Nations Population Division. That's huge increase. Our population will be doubled in Nigeria, for example, from current 200 million to 400 million by 2050. Now, in that kind of a world, with young people being to ask, what's the way out? You will say, well, of course, you need to invest more. You need to invest more to provide jobs. Okay, so you can now see the circularity here. Investment here means mining more natural capital. So we're back to the argument I gave before. So we do have something like a situation where you're trying the economic model that we are following in the absence of anything about, say, family planning, reproductive health, taking population seriously in those countries themselves, means you're looking at a development process which is akin to trying to walk up an escalator which is coming down at the same speed. Okay. And that's and maybe it's coming down at a faster speed because you're actually mining natural capital. It's not a funny situation. It's an extremely serious situation. Yes. And at my age, I feel I've earned the right, and particularly given the experience I've had in teaching so many African students, so that I'm very deep affection for people in that continent, for those I know, I've visited them.
So how does this bear, excuse me,
yeah,
in terms, what does this imply about the specific type of policy interventions, if any, to try to help reduce fertility rates? To what extent is it advancing the provision of contraceptive materials, or is it in expanding the social standing or opportunities, economic opportunities of women, something else? How can this be done both fairly and effectively, in your view?
It has to be done by them, and we should not prejudge it. And we think that we represent them and say that this is not to be discussed. But of course, we are discussing it with the political authorities, many of whom are male. We should be talking to young women who do not have any access to family planning, modern family planning techniques. So we've got something like 200 to 220 million people, women, with the expressed unmet need for family planning. Okay, so we could kickstart there. And during that period, with that, my review came out in February 2nd last year, and the Treasury backed it all the way. And the response was very positive. Guess what? Within 3 weeks, the new aid budget of the UK government slashed family planning expenditure to nearly zero. So we really, I mean, it's unbelievable that we talk about women's empowerment, and yet we do not create a system of thought which enables them, with help of policy, to have control some over their own bodies, for heaven's sake. Spacing of births, for example, if nothing else. So this is, it's so far as I'm concerned, I think it's one of the, it's the intellectuals' weakest, the feeblest, how do I put it? I find it rather repulsive, the attitude we have to this.
Well, in a way, by addressing the population issue, you've also, in so doing, suggested some of the political challenges. Let me, an hour is too short, but I want to ask you one last question before we turn the controls or the questions over to the audience. And that is, Stanford's in the process of introducing a new school focused on sustainability. And I want to ask you, if you were offered the opportunity to offer, say, one key bit of advice to the folks, excuse me, that's reminding me that it's time for Q&A, bit of advice to the folks involved in planning the structure or the research focus or the curriculum of the new school, what would your advice be? And by the way, to the listeners, we have not rehearsed this. I have no idea what Partha is going to say.
Well, thank you very much. Well, first of all, I want to say, before giving to SVB just in 1 minute, is that I've been very candid here, and I've spoken perhaps more forcefully than I'm prone to doing. And that's because I'm part of Stanford. It's my home. I've learned enormous amounts. I was a professor with a colleague of yours, as you know, and I have deep affection for it. So I feel I'm allowed to speak my mind at the dinner table of my big family. Okay, so that's the background. So I'm not usually as forceful as my condemnation of the way contemporary thinking, which is extremely important. It's not just a dinner party issue. It's not a question of, in a club. This is serious business. We are looking at the future of humanity, let alone the segments of it. What would I want to see happen? Well, I think Stanford is smart enough. You're going to have a fantastic center, no question about it. But what I would urge you to have include in it is population. So you should see the problem of our place in nature and therefore sustainable development or sustainability studies through the lens of population, consumption, and environment, not just consumption and environment, which is why you kept the question of population right to the end, because standard environmental and resource economics has nothing to say on population. They avoid it like crazy. Even ecologists don't talk about population, except for, of course, my friends at Stanford. But then I'm back to where I started by saying my original education on this problem came from this great book on ecoscience by Ehrlich, and Holdren.
Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate your comments. And let's hear, there's a great many questions that the audience has asked. Let me pick a couple, and my apologies to those for whom we don't have time to answer your questions. One is, can you give examples where we are properly pricing for, or in other ways, dealing with the negative externalities associated with the loss of nature services?
Yes, locally, I think in various parts of the world, in local authorities, it's happening. Lots of good things are happening. I mean, payment for ecosystem services, I think, is a very major movement, and I hope it spreads in the way I was suggesting, not just horizontally, but vertically as well to the international sphere. Then in the urban areas, there is now an increasing interest or understanding of the impact of nature on our well-being, not just in the food we eat, but not the toxicity, but just to be able to enjoy nature. So there's a great deal that's happening of that kind, and I think these are. What I feel, however, is that there isn't really. I feel sorry about this. At least I'm looking at it from the UK side. I think ultimately the problem is one which has to be faced by the citizen. In some sense, my review was addressing the citizen, not the government, and that's why I produced a 100-page summary of it, which is non-technical. I was addressing the citizen because it is the citizen who has to shape the way we move forward. And I don't see that happening amongst the young. I don't see that amongst college students, for example, in this part of the world. I don't see that. Of course, there will be environment, there'll be societies which care about the environment and so forth. But the complaints they make are about very personalized matters, not about, it's about the self. And the irony of the ecological economics lies in the fact that it is, at the end of the day, is about the self. But that has to be, our concern about the self needs to be shaped in a wider context. And that tension between the collective and the individual is something which I tried to bring out at length. That's why I do the 600-page document. But it's not something that is very easy to harness. And so it depends on how active citizens in those parts of the world where we can express our views, and we are happily fortunate enough to be in that part of the world where we actually take our place in the biosphere seriously. Finally, there is something more important which to bear in mind. I'm increasingly impressed by the work by evolutionary biologists about the fact that there's a conceit, modern conceit, that we are in some sense outside nature. And of course, the economic models are not in some sense, but very explicitly that we are outside nature. But there is at the broader intellectual level, there is this sense that we're independent. We are blank canvases into which we can paint anything we like about our future, about our abilities, about our economic possibilities. And I think that's been a very big mistake. I'm increasingly influenced by the works of those who have shown us how embedded we are from the evolutionary past onto what we see as dangers, what we see as possibilities, and of course, reflecting our place and what we should value. So, but if we can understand that intellectually, the hope is that we'll be able to translate that into an active engagement on a daily basis.
Well, actually, in the process of talking about your review, you answered one of the questions that came up, which is the review just for academics? I'm glad that there's actually several versions of the review. There's the less technical abridged version, which you intentionally, one of the reasons for it is so that it would have wider access.
Yeah.
So those of you interested in who may not have 25 years of PhD level technique behind you in economics, I think you'll still find it very accessible. Another question that came up, and there are many here, I apologize, we won't get to them all, is the question about economic growth. Is there a way in which we can have perpetual economic growth that is sustainable? And I guess part of it is growth of what? So what is your view on that?
I interpreted your notion of growth, I mean, not but the way you were representing economics, was growth in GDP. The answer is no. And the reason is that there is a limit to the efficiency with which we can convert Mother Nature's goods and services into final products. If that could go to infinity, then yes. And that's been the basis of all the growth models that we've studied. By the way, I know the growth models extremely well, so I know where the subtle errors are, okay? It's not a question of that they're unrealistic or that everything is unrealistic. Any model is unrealistic, so that's not the issue. The issue is, are there some subtle hidden assumption which nobody has noticed, which is doing the work for you, which is perpetual growth of GDP, of final products, if you like, okay? That's not possible because it's not possible to convert. If you think of the waste that's a company's output, then you can immediately see that we have a problem. Because if you overburden Mother Nature with waste, then the entire vector of services gets skewed up. And you can see that even in climate change, because after all, our waste is carbon emission, and that's biodegradable. So you said, what's the problem then? The problem is that the system doesn't have the capacity to degrade that ably, if you like, in the way that we are used to at the level at which we are pumping the stuff out. So the answer is no. But in any case, we shouldn't be looking at GDP. We should be looking at wealth, because that's what corresponds to our notion of a dynastic welfare, well-being. So we ought to be asking, is our wealth increasing? And even there, of course, it will be a finite limit to it, but that's not something we should be worried about. Why should we care as to what happens? I mean, if we can get our institutions right now, as it were, then we'll veer in a different direction and think. We shouldn't be asking questions like, what will the standard of living be? Because we don't know. The direction of technological change will alter if we stop paying for what we consume. Because instead of labor-saving devices, we'll be thinking in terms of, entrepreneurs will be thinking of nature-saving devices, because they'll be the expensive objects. So they will wish to economize on them. And of course, the direction in which we'll be moving is unpredictable, but we do know in the sense that it'll be not rapacious on the use of nature, which has been the history of technological progress over the last 300-400 years, because nature is underpriced. So why should you economize on nature? If it's free, you want to create techniques of production which make more use of it rather than less.
I just want to make sure people don't misinterpret. When you say ultimately what we want is to think about future wealth and hopefully even increasing, at least according to the theory, the way wealth is calculated, if calculated appropriately,
Oh, yes, of course.
Really, it's a measure of well-being. It's not simply a number of dollars in the bank.
No, absolutely. We're
So
talking about
I think that basically what you're saying is what we want is growth of well-being, as hard as that is to measure.
Absolutely.
Even if we don't have growth in GDP, at least that is your point. I hope folks will indulge me if we address one last question and then we'll conclude. We may go over for a few minutes, but it has to do with technological change. The question was, to what extent can engineers come up with the technologies that will overcome without serious, what's the word that was used? Serious sticks. I think what they mean is price increases, so that we can solve the climate problem and other problems without these punitive policies. What is your view on that?
Well, it's a tough question to answer right at the end, but let me wait for one minute or two, which is, first of all, I think in some deep sense, the economics of climate change has misdirected us, because there's a quick fix, at least theoretically, which is move to clean energy. Move away from fossil fuels to renewables, let us say, okay. And what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with that. That's exactly right. But the picture that's painted is that may be a metaphor for all our dealings with nature. Remember, move from fossil fuels to clean energy is a move away from inefficient transformation of Mother Nature's goods and services into final products to more efficient ones, okay? And so this suggests that, look, we can make that efficiency so powerful that we don't have to rely on fossil fuels. So we have clean energy, and so that enables us to think in terms of perpetual growth of income. That's been an extremely misleading picture, because the other services that Mother Nature offers us, not just climate regulation, they're all complementary to one another. So if we overburden one of them, then the others sufficiently, then the others come tumbling down too, as climate change is threatening to do with the others. Okay, so we have to look at it that way. So that's the first point. The second point is that because there's no technological fix to the notion that we've been discussing here, there's really institutional changes and behavioral changes, and that will lead to technological changes in a direction which will be consistent with it. It means that we are, what can I say? It means that we shouldn't be thinking of engineers. Why isn't the question simultaneously asking, what about ecologists helping? Because we think of technological change in terms of scientists and engineers. And I know what that means, because that's the thing I'm trying to fight. That is to say, we ought to be, in order to invest in nature, I wouldn't go to an engineer. I would go to the ecologist, the hydrologist, because they'll be telling me how best to help Mother Nature recover. Okay? And so you can see where I'm heading. That is to say, I think in some deep sense, we've been constrained by our past 300 years of success, quote unquote, and very seriously. I mean, we live longer, we eat better, etc. The whole works. And we thrive on the fact that we've been a very successful economy, globally at least, on average, and so forth. But it has brought us to have a language which I think is extremely misleading as of now. And I've given you lots of examples in this last 1 hour as to why, in what way. So, as I say, why should we think only of engineers when it comes to technological change? We ought to be looking for the ecologist as well.
Well, let me offer a slight, perhaps a helpful perspective on what you just said that might appease some of the talented engineers on campus.
Oh,
I don't think you're saying that we don't want technological breakthroughs. We don't want the discovery of new processes that can provide us energy in a cleaner way. But I think what I interpret you're saying is that the focus we can't exclude the focus on the unfortunate patterns of consumption and production that we currently have. And if we only think about technological breakthroughs without changing those patterns, we're missing perhaps the biggest part of the story. Or am I being unfair?
No, that's exactly right. This was not to dismiss the idea of moving to clean energy. I wasn't suggesting that at all.
Or the new inventions.
metaphor
Okay.
for the ecological dilemma that we have now, because it
Okay.
misleads for reasons that I've already made. I hope it's clear, but certainly my review has it abundantly clear. I'd like to think.
Well, we have to stop. An hour is too short. Speaking from the heart, this has been such a pleasure to talk with you, to interact with you, even if it has to have been virtual. I'm just tremendously grateful for your insights and grateful for all you have done over the years, in my view, to help us understand and solve these critical threats to sustainability, including threats to biodiversity. So I can only thank you, but I also hope that we'll be able to get you here at Stanford in person for an extended time so we can take a lot more time to benefit from you. But thank you very much once again. And thank you, all of you who are tuning in. I hope you found it insightful and worth your time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. And once your center is established, perhaps you'll invite me to visit it. I would love to come.
You got it. Thanks.
Good night then.